Welcome to the DX Today podcast, your daily deep dive into the AI ecosystem. I'm Chris, and joining me as always is Laura.
Great to be back, Chris. I have been completely buried in research on this one all weekend, and I can tell you I have not been this fired up about a story in months. Because what Anthropic just put into early access might actually reset the frontier race for the rest of the year.
Well, that is a pretty big promise to open the show with, so you had better deliver, because our listeners have come to expect nothing less from you on a Monday morning.
Oh, I will deliver. Today we are talking about Claude Mythos, Anthropic's new 10 trillion parameter model. And this might actually be the most consequential frontier model announcement of the year so far.
10 trillion parameters is a number that kind of breaks the brain when you first hear it. So before we go anywhere, can you ground that for us? What does that actually mean in plain English?
Sure, think of parameters as the tunable dials inside a neural network. GPT-4 had roughly 1.8 trillion. Opus 4.6 sits in a similar neighborhood. Mythos takes that dial count and multiplies it by roughly 5.
So we are not talking about a 20% improvement or even a doubling. This is a step change in raw scale, at a moment when plenty of smart people were arguing that scaling laws had finally plateaued.
Exactly. And that is why this matters beyond the headline number. For 2 years, the running narrative was that pure scaling had hit diminishing returns, and everyone was pivoting to algorithmic efficiency and post-training tricks.
Right, the whole inference, time compute, and test time reasoning wave we have been tracking for 2 years was essentially an admission from the field that simply throwing more parameters at the problem was not the cleanest path forward anymore for frontier intelligence.
And Anthropic just went and threw more parameters at it anyway, and apparently got a step change in capability. That is a genuinely provocative result for the scaling hypothesis debate.
Before we go deeper, let's back up and talk about how this thing even became public. Because the rollout here has been anything but ordinary for a company that usually runs a disciplined launch.
Oh, the backstory is wild. On March 26th, Anthropic had a content management system misconfiguration that accidentally exposed roughly 3,000 internal assets, including a draft announcement blog for Mythos.
So the world learned about what may be the most important model of the year, not from a polished keynote or a scripted product page, but from an accidental internal leak that reporters scraped in real time.
Pretty much. And the draft blog post did not pull punches. It called Mythos by far the most powerful AI model we have ever developed and used the phrase step change to describe the jump.
Step change is a very specific word choice for a research lab that normally talks in careful, hedged, incremental language. That phrase in a draft blog means they believe something important has happened internally.
Right. And what I find fascinating is Anthropic has not denied any of it. They confirmed the model exists, confirmed the early access program, and basically said the leak forced them to get ahead of it.
Let's talk about that early access program in some detail, because this is where the story turns, from being a pure scaling milestone into a global security conversation. And I think the program name itself tells you 90% of the story before you even look at the participant list.
The program is called Project Glasswing, and the participant list reads like a who is who of the critical infrastructure stack. AWS, Apple, Broadcom, Cisco, CrowdStrike, Google, JPMorgan Chase, Microsoft, Nvidia.
You can add Palo Alto Networks and the Linux Foundation to that list, plus roughly 40 other organizations that have not been publicly named. That is a very deliberate slice of the economy.
And notice what is conspicuously missing from that list. No consumer companies, no media companies, no retailers, no advertising platforms. Project Glasswing is overwhelmingly cybersecurity vendors, cloud providers, major banks, and foundational software maintainers, which tells you exactly who Anthropic thinks needs this capability first.
Which tells you everything about what Anthropic thinks this model is actually for in its first act. This is not a consumer chatbot launch in any traditional sense of the word.
Exactly. Mythos in early access is a cybersecurity defense tool. And the reason they are limiting access so carefully is because of what happens when you scale capability this fast on offensive security tasks.
That is the part I want to dig into, because the UK AI Security Institute evaluation on Mythos Preview was the most sobering third-party benchmark I've read in a long time.
The headline stat from the UK AISI evaluation is brutal. On expert-level cyber tasks that no model could complete before April of 2025, Mythos Preview succeeds 73% of the time.
Let's slow down on that number, because it really deserves a second read. A year ago, the pass rate on these expert tasks was essentially 0. Now it is almost 3/4.
And these are not toy problems. We are talking about identifying unknown vulnerabilities in real production code bases, chaining exploits across systems, understanding obfuscated malware, tasks that typically require human experts with years of training.
There's also that almost cinematic anecdote from the early tests where Mythos uncovered a 27-year-old vulnerability that had been sitting undiscovered in OpenBSD the whole time.
27 years. OpenBSD is arguably the most security-audited operating system on the planet, reviewed by elite human eyes continuously for decades. Mythos found something they all missed, and it did it quickly.
So the defensive story is that we can finally hand this model a large code base and get a meaningful security audit that actually surfaces serious bugs. That is a genuinely transformative capability for defenders.
But the offensive flip side is what keeps everyone up at night. The same model that finds a 27-year-old bug for a defender can also find it for an attacker who gets access to similar capability.
Which is why Anthropic is being so cagey about a full public release. They have explicitly said the model is very expensive to serve and will be very expensive for customers, but cost is not the real gating factor.
The real gating factor is that they want to ensure defenders reach critical systems first, before attackers can deploy equivalent capability at scale. It is basically a new kind of responsible disclosure, except at the model level rather than the vulnerability level, giving the defender community an asymmetric head start.
The Council on Foreign Relations literally called Mythos an inflection point for AI and global security, and I think that framing is actually warranted rather than just being a dramatic headline.
A word on pricing before we talk about what this means strategically. Anthropic has been blunt that Mythos will be very expensive to serve and very expensive for customers, and current reporting suggests inference will run somewhere between 5 and 10 times the cost of Opus per token, putting it firmly in the tier where only very specific high-value workloads can actually justify the spend.
Which directly explains the Glasswing participant list. JPMorgan Chase is not using Mythos to answer retail banking questions. They are almost certainly pointing it at their trading systems, their fraud detection stack, and their security operations center, where a single discovered vulnerability can prevent a 9-figure loss event.
There is also the governance question worth flagging for listeners. Anthropic is effectively deciding, privately, who gets asymmetric cyber capability and who does not. And that is a quietly enormous amount of discretionary power for one private company to hold over critical infrastructure access, which is exactly why they have been so careful to involve third-party evaluators like the UK AI Security Institute.
Let's zoom back out to the broader scaling question for a minute. Because Mythos has implications for OpenAI and Google that go way beyond any single security story, and the competitive dynamics at the frontier of the industry just shifted in a very noticeable way.
Anthropic is currently sitting at roughly $30 billion in annualized revenue. They are not a scrappy underdog anymore. They are a top 3 frontier lab with the capital to actually compete at this scale.
And if Mythos genuinely delivers a step change rather than an incremental bump, the pressure on Google and OpenAI to respond with their own 10 trillion parameter class models becomes extraordinary almost overnight. Because no one at the top of this market can afford to cede raw capability to a rival for very long.
Gemini 3.1 Ultra came out 2 weeks ago with a 2 million token context window, but that was still essentially a Gemini 3.0 architecture tuned for efficiency, not a fundamental scale leap.
And OpenAI has been quiet on the frontier model front since GPT 5.4 shipped in March. If Mythos is real, expect to see a 5.5 or a 6 preview sooner rather than later.
The interesting architectural wrinkle worth pausing on is that Mythos uses a mixture of experts design. So you get 10 trillion parameters in total weight, but each inference call only routes through a small fraction of them, maybe on the order of a few 100 billion active parameters per token at most.
Which means the compute per token is not 10 times more expensive than Opus. It is meaningfully higher, but it is not linearly scaling with parameter count, and that changes the economics quite a bit.
That also explains why Anthropic thinks they can actually serve this commercially at any price point at all. Pure, dense 10 trillion parameter inference would be close to physically impossible on current hardware.
MoE has been the open secret of frontier labs for a while. Google's Gemini family, Mistral's flagship models, DeepSeek, they all lean on it heavily. Mythos just pushes the sparse routing strategy to a new extreme.
And one thing worth noting for listeners who follow the open weight side of the world, this is a fully closed model. Anthropic is not shipping Mythos weights to anybody, and that is a very deliberate choice.
Which is a real contrast to what we covered with RCAI's 400 billion parameter open source release earlier this month. The frontier is bifurcating into two very different philosophies of deployment.
Exactly. Open weights groups are saying the safest path is full transparency and community review. Closed labs like Anthropic are saying the safest path is controlled distribution with staged access for vetted defenders.
Both positions have serious adherents and serious arguments behind them. And Mythos is going to become the new lightning rod in that debate for the rest of this year, probably longer.
For our listeners, here's the takeaway I would leave you with. If you're in any kind of infrastructure or security role, you need to be planning for a world where attackers eventually get Mythos-class capability too.
Which means threat modeling, vulnerability management, and code review all need to assume a step change in adversary capability. The status quo of most corporate security programs is not going to hold up.
And if you are in enterprise deployment planning, watch carefully who gets added to Project Glasswing over the coming weeks. The list will tell you a lot about where Anthropic sees the priority attack surface.
One last thought before we wrap. Anthropic has not released a system card, has not published benchmarks, and has not committed to a public release date. That silence is part of the message itself.
Agreed. The silence says this capability is powerful enough that they are not comfortable letting the usual launch playbook run. And that kind of candor from a frontier lab is actually refreshing in its own way.
So to summarize, Mythos is the first publicly acknowledged 10 trillion parameter model. It crushes expert cyber benchmarks. It is in a closed preview called Project Glasswing, and it has reset the frontier race overnight.
And the next 6 months are going to tell us whether this is a defining inflection point or a very expensive, interesting footnote, depending on how the rest of the lab ecosystem responds.
Laura, thank you as always for bringing the rigor and the curiosity to this one. I know our listeners will want to dig into the UKAC evaluation and the CFR piece for themselves.
Thanks, Chris, and listeners. If you like these deep dives, please rate the show, share it with a colleague, and send us your suggestions for future topics. Your feedback keeps us going every morning.
That's all for today's episode of the DX Today podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.